Nneka sat by the window of their apartment, her weary eyes gazing at the bustling streets of Lagos below. The sun was setting, casting an orange glow that painted everything in a false sense of peace. But there was no peace for Nneka, not in her heart. Emmanuel and Emanuela, her 1-year-old twins, lay asleep on the mattress behind her. Their soft breath were the only thing keeping her grounded. They were her joy, her strength, but also the source of her greatest sorrow. It wasn't supposed to be like this. She was 19 when she met Donald, a charming young man with a smile that could melt the toughest heart. He had been her sanctuary in a world filled with struggles. Her father, a strict yet loving man, had reluctantly agreed to their union after Donald swore to the heavens that he would support her dreams of becoming a graduate. Donald's words had been sweet honey dripping into her ears. "I will take care of you, Nneka. You will finish school and we will build a life together." Those words were now a cruel joke. Nneka wiped a tear as she remembered her father's dying words, spoken a month after her wedding. "Be strong, my daughter. You deserve happiness." But happiness was as distant as the horizon. Donald's transformation was swift and brutal. After Emmanuel and Emanuela were born, the sweet promises gave way to wickedness. He barked at her for the smallest things: cold food, a misplaced item, a crying baby. Her pleas for support were met with accusation. "You are lazy, Nneka," he hissed, throwing a crumpled naira note onto the table. "What do you even do all day? Just sit home like a queen while I slave at work?" But Donald's cruelty didn't stop there. He had forbidden her from working or starting a business, claiming it was beneath his status for his wife to hustle. Yet, whenever she asked for money for baby formula, he would ridicule her, making her feel like a beggar in her own home. The twins were malnourished, and Nneka's once radiant skin was now ugly and stretched thin over her bones. The truth was, Donald had moved on. His secret affair with Felicity, an international model, consumed his attention and finances. Felicity was beautiful, glamorous, and everything Donald wanted in a trophy partner. The twins were merely collateral damage in his grand plan to reshape his life. Nneka was a shadow, a burden he was determined to dump. One evening, Donald came home, his cologne as sharp as his mood. Nneka approached him hesitantly, her heart pounding. "Donald, we need more baby formula. Emmanuel has been crying all day." Donald's response was cold and cutting, and he said, "I don't have money to waste on your incompetence, Nneka. Why can't you manage what you have?" "But don't talk back to me." Donald's voice thundered through the apartment. "Do you know how hard I work? And you can't even keep a home." Nneka's silence was her only defense. She knew if she argued, he would report her to his family again. They were vultures, always circling, ready to pounce on her weakness. They had once told her she was too weak and too foolish to be a proper wife. The memory of their venomous words burned in her chest. Unbeknownst to her, Donald had been making anonymous calls to child care services, painting her as an unfit mother. He would describe her as mentally unstable, incapable of caring for her children. To solidify his claims, he manipulated her appearance and state of mind. He denied her basic necessities, forcing her to wear tattered clothes and live in squalor. When social workers arrived, they found a sick-looking, disheveled woman who seemed to confirm every word of Donald's fabricated story. The day the twins were taken away from her was the darkest day of her life. Nneka screamed and clung to Emmanuel and Emanuela as the officers snatched the twins from her arms. "Please," Nneka said, "don't take my babies. They need me," she cried, her voice breaking with despair. But her cries fell on deaf ears. Donald stood in the background, feigning helplessness, and said to the social welfare officers, "I've been trying to support her," he lied, tears glistening in his eyes, "but I can't do it alone." That night, Nneka lay coiled up on the cold floor. She cried and cried. She felt like a mother bird with her wings clipped, watching helplessly as predators stole her young. Donald's calculated cruelty had reached its peak, and she was left with nothing. No children, no family, no hope. But deep inside, a fire burned. It was faint like a dying ember, but it was there. Nneka resolved to fight. She didn't know how or when, but she would not let anyone separate her from her children. The name Nneka meant mother is supreme, and she would live up to it. For Emanuela and Emmanuel, she would rise from the ashes. The courtroom was stifling, not because of lack of air condition, but because of the weight of emotion that filled the air. Nneka sat at the plaintiff table, her hands trembling as she clutched the edge of the table for support. Her lawyer, Christiana Udo, was a fierce and brilliant woman, known for her compassion towards disadvantaged women. Christiana had agreed to take on Nneka's case pro bono after hearing the gut-wrenching detail of her story. On the other side of the courtroom sat Donald, his suit impeccable, tailored, his expression unreadable but snug. Beside him was a high-profile lawyer who reeked of arrogance and confidence. Felicity was not present in court. She never bothered to dirty her hands with situations she deemed beneath her status. The case was a custody battle for Emmanuel and Emanuela, and the stakes couldn't have been higher. For Nneka, it wasn't just about getting her children back. It was about reclaiming her dignity, proving to the world that she wasn't the deranged, unfit mother Donald had painted her to be. The hearing began with opening statements. Donald's lawyer rose first, his voice as smooth as oil. Your Honor, we are here today to ensure the safety and well-being of two innocent children, Emmanuel and Emanuela. My client, Mr. Donald Okafor, is a hardworking, responsible father who has done everything in his power to provide for his family. Unfortunately, his wife, Mrs. Nneka Okafor, has displayed erratic and unstable behavior, rendering her incapable of properly caring for the children. It is the best interest of these children to remain under the care of the government until suitable arrangements are made, and the father of the children, Mr. Donald Okafor, also agrees with the government. Nneka was shocked to hear this, and when she saw her husband sitting with the state defense lawyer and working to take her children away from her, it was now obvious to Nneka that it was her husband who had called the social welfare into their lives, and that he wants to drive her mad by separating her from her children. Christiana, her lawyer, stood up next. She addressed the court with measured confidence. Your Honor, this case is not just about custody. It is about a mother's right to raise her children and the malicious efforts of a man who has systematically sought to destroy her. Mrs. Nneka Okafor is not unstable, nor is she unfit. She is a victim of psychological abuse and manipulation. We will prove that Mr. Donald Okafor's actions are not those of a concerned father, but of a man desperate to cover his deceit and selfish ambitions. The judge, a stern-looking woman in her 50s, nodded. Proceed with your evidence, counsel. The first to testify was a social welfare officer, Mrs. Johnson, who had overseen the case. She described the state in which they had found Nneka, disheveled, depressed, and seemingly incapable of caring for the twins. She said, I found Mrs. Okafor in tattered clothing, with the children crying. The environment was a bit unhygienic, and she appeared mentally distressed. Christiana stood to cross-examine the social welfare officer. Mrs. Johnson, she said, thank you for your testimony, but can you confirm whether you conducted a psychological evaluation of my client, Mrs. Nneka Okafor, before concluding she was mentally distressed? The officer shifted uncomfortably and replied, no, we didn't. Can you confirm whether you investigated Mr. Donald Okafor's involvement in the household? Did you ask why the environment was a bit unhygienic, or whether my client had access to the resources needed to maintain the home? No, we didn't, the officer admitted. Christiana pressed on, her voice firm but respectful. Is it true that the complaint filed against my client was anonymous? Yes, replied the officer. Christiana now said, and yet you acted on it without verifying the source or the circumstances. Your Honor, Christiana turned, addressing the judge. I submit that this testimony is based on assumptions rather than facts. The judge nodded, her pen scratching across the notepad in front of her. When Donald took the stand, his charm was palpable. He spoke of his long work hours, his alleged efforts to support Nneka, and his heartbreak over her supposed mental decline. He said, I tried, Your Honor. I really did, but she refused to take care of herself or the children. I even suggested therapy, but she wouldn't listen. Christiana's turn to cross-examine him was surgical. Mr. Okafor, can you tell the court why your wife was unable to provide for herself and the children? Did you at any point forbid her from working or starting a business? Donald hesitated and said, I didn't forbid her. I simply advised her to focus on the children. So to clarify, you restricted her ability to earn an income, but you criticized her for not having money. Is that correct? That's not what I said, Donald stammered. But that is the implication, Mr. Okafor. Let's move on. Can you explain why, despite your claims of concern, you did not provide adequate financial support for food and basic necessities? Donald fidgeted and replied, I gave her money. Maybe she mismanaged it. Christiana asked, do you have evidence of consistent financial support, such as bank statements or receipts? Donald's lawyers objected, but the judge overruled. Donald stammered, I don't know. Christiana's voice grew sharper. One final question, Mr. Okafor. Are you in a relationship with Felicity Olumide, an international model? The court buzzed with whispers. Donald's face darkened, and he said, that's irrelevant. Christiana said to him, it speaks to your character and priorities, Mr. Okafor. Is it true that you spend money on maintaining a relationship with Olumide while claiming to be financially strained? Donald refused to answer, his silence loud. When Nneka took the stand, her voice was shaky but resolute. She recounted the abuse, the humiliation, and the heartache of losing her children. She said, I did everything I could with the little I had. Her voice breaking. Donald controlled every aspect of my life. He made me feel worthless, but I never stopped loving my children. They are my life. Christiana approached her gently. Nneka, what does your name mean? Nneka replied, it means mother is supreme. And do you believe that no one can love a child more than their mother? Yes, Nneka replied, tears streaming down her face. Christiana's team had uncovered a paper trail of Donald's deceit. They presented evidence of anonymous calls to child care services, his extravagant spending on Felicity, and his deliberate attempts to isolate Nneka. Christiana, in her closing argument, said, Your Honor, this is not the case of an unfit mother. This is the case of a manipulative husband using his power and privilege to destroy a woman's life for his own selfish gain. The judge adjourned the hearing, promising to deliver a verdict soon. Nneka left the courtroom that day with a glimmer of hope, but the toll of the fight weighed heavily on her. She was exhausted emotionally and physically, but she knew she couldn't give up. As she walked out of the court, Christiana placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. We will get your children back, Nneka. Trust me. Nneka nodded, her resolve strengthening. She would fight until her last breath to be reunited with Emmanuel and Emanuela. They were her reason to keep living, her light in the darkness. The courtroom was silent as the judge took her seat to deliver the verdict. The tension in the air was palpable. Christiana sat beside her, her reassuring presence a pillar of strength. Donald sat across the room, his confidence still lingering, but not as resolute as it had been. The judge cleared her throat and said, "After reviewing the evidence and hearing all testimonies, this court has reached a decision. Custody battles are never easy, especially when the well-being of innocent children is at stake. However, it is this court's duty to ensure that Emmanuel and Emanuela are placed in the environment that best fosters their growth." Nneka crushed Christiana's hand, her nails digging into her palm. She didn't dare to breathe. The judge continued, "It is evident from the testimony and evidence presented that the accusations against Mrs. Nneka Okafor were not only exaggerated, but deliberately constructed to malign her character. The court has determined that Mrs. Okafor has been a victim of sustained psychological abuse and manipulation, orchestrated by Mr. Donald Okafor." The room erupted in whispers. The judge raised her hand to silence them. Furthermore, the court finds Mr. Okafor's action, including his financial negligence and lack of emotional support, do not align with the responsibilities of a father. As such, custody of Emmanuel and Emanuela is hereby awarded to their mother, Mrs. Nneka Okafor. Nneka gasped, her tears falling freely. Nneka's tears were a mix of relief, joy, and exhaustion. Donald stormed out of the courtroom, his defeat a stark contrast to the arrogance he had carried throughout the trial. Later that day, Nneka arrived at the Child Welfare Center to pick up Emmanuel and Emanuela. She held them tightly, promising never to let go. "Mommy missed you so much," she whispered, her tears soaking into their hair. As they left the center, Nneka looked at Christiana, who stood at a distance, watching the reunion with a smile. Nneka walked over and said, "Thank you, Christiana. I don't know how I will ever repay you." "You have already repaid me," Christiana said, her voice soft. "Seeing you with your children, knowing they are safe and loved, that's all the repayment I need. Remember, Nneka, you are not just a mother, you are their mother, and that makes you unstoppable." Months later, Nneka's life had taken a turn for the better. She started a small catering business with the help of a community grant Christiana had helped her secure. Emmanuel and Emanuela were thriving, their laughter filling the modest home they now called theirs. As Nneka tucked her twins into bed one night, she was about to turn off the lights. Nneka paused for a moment, her heart swelling with gratitude and hope. She was no longer the woman who had been broken and beaten by life. She was Nneka, the mother and protector of her children, the architect of their brighter future. And as she lay in bed that night, she realized that the fight had been worth it. For Emmanuel and Emanuela, for herself, and for the unshakable truth that a mother's love could move mountains.